All right, we're going to get started here. Thanks everybody for coming. This is really a great audience and we're excited to talk to you about the research that we're conducting and the specific reforms that we're studying. So today we're going to be talking about what's next for developmental reform. Before we get into the details of the research and the projects, I just want to make a note. We've been asked to be sure to try to use the microphones. We really want this to be an interactive session though. So if you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to interrupt. You can come up to the microphone or if it's easier to just raise your hand, I can try to repeat the question for other people in the audience. But don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions. This is very new research. This center was just established last summer, and it's a grant that lasts for 5 years, so these are long research projects. This is an early stage, and we're really excited to be talking with you today about it, and to hear your thoughts on what you're doing, get your feedback, and also answer any questions that you have. So we're going to be talking about the research agenda for the Center for the Analysis of Postsecondary Readiness. As I mentioned, this was a center that was established last summer by the Institute of Education Sciences in the Department of Education. And it's set up really to provide more information and more knowledge about what's happening in developmental education, how things are changing, what is the current lay of the landscape across the country, and what is working for developmental education students. Before jumping into the actual research projects that we have underway in the center, I just want to take a minute to talk about the scope of the problem. Now, none of this is news for any of you, but it's really important to think about sort of the core problems and the multifaceted nature that challenges that developmental education students face, because they're really driving the programs that we're studying and the research agenda for the National Center. So nationally, about half of all college students take at least one remedial or developmental education course while they're in college, but this problem is really pronounced for community college students. About 2/3 of all community college students take a developmental education course in at least one subject area. This means the colleges are finding that they're not academically prepared for college-level courses, and many of these students are taking more than one course or more than one subject area in Dev Ed. Often these courses are in fact sequences of courses, and students have to take 1, 2, sometimes 3 courses before they can advance to the college level, and it's really posing a problem for community colleges across the country. Once we start to look at who is actually taking these courses, the problem takes on even greater significance. Less than half of all students who take a developmental education course successfully make it through the sequence of courses and into college-level courses. Among these students, only 1/3 ever earn a post-secondary credential. So this is a huge problem. Students are coming into college underprepared, or they're being assigned to colleges, and it predominantly affects low-income and minority students. These students are overrepresented among our developmental education population. But in fact, this is only part of the problem. While most students are underprepared, there's a growing body of research that suggests many of these students may be underplaced. So when students take assessment tests, they're placed into college-level courses or to Dev Ed courses, but many students who are placed into developmental education courses may in fact be able to succeed in college-level courses, but they're misplaced into these Dev Ed courses, which means they have a longer sequence of courses to take to earn a credential at the very least. But in some cases, the courses themselves may be discouraging, the whole process may be discouraging, and we may be unnecessarily holding back students who are in fact ready and prepared to succeed in college-level courses. So again, none of this is really a surprise. Colleges are doing a lot of work across the country to reform developmental education and to try to improve outcomes for developmental education students. But we really lack systematic research on Dev Ed practices. There's some research on assessment practices that's systematic across the country, but we know colleges are changing their practices regularly, And we don't know a lot about how they're changing, about what's happened recently, about the reforms that are being initiated. We know about individual colleges. We know about pockets of colleges and what they're doing. But we don't know how to really describe what's happening on a national scale, particularly at a time now when colleges are doing a lot to innovate and to try new things to help community college students, and particularly DevEd students, succeed. And so this is really the context for this large research agenda that we have to study developmental education in the United States. So this center, as I mentioned, was funded by the Institute for Education Sciences. It's a collaborative project between MDRC, where I work and where Alyssa works, and CCRC, where Elizabeth works. We have 3 large-scale research projects designed to address the issues that I was just talking about. The first is a descriptive study. This is really designed to assess the state of developmental education and how it's changing across the country. So we're designing and we'll be conducting a large national survey of about 1,700 colleges and asking them a range of questions that I'll be talking about shortly. The study also includes at least 80 in-depth qualitative interviews with college and system level leaders to provide more context and more depth to the types of questions that we're asking in the survey, and to really paint a fuller picture of what's known and what colleges are doing across the country in developmental education. We also have 2 large evaluation projects. The first is an evaluation of new assessment practices. So colleges are starting to use new algorithms to figure out how to assign students to college level or developmental courses. Here we're going to be doing a large-scale random assignment study at multiple colleges across the state of New York, in which these colleges, in collaboration with our research team, are developing new algorithms that use students' previous history to assign them to college-level courses or to developmental education. And the hope is really that we're able to successfully and more accurately predict how students are prepared for college-level courses, and to get more students directly into those courses who are prepared to succeed, but also to place students more accurately into developmental education when they need it. And Elizabeth will be talking more about the algorithms and the study itself. The third project is another evaluation study. It's a study of the New Mathways Project, which is a comprehensive math reform in the state of Texas. It's happening across colleges throughout Texas. And Alyssa will be talking about the study itself, about the program, the research that we've conducted up to this point, and what we have planned for an evaluation study moving forward. We also have 2 smaller supplemental studies. The first is a study of an early start program in California. This is a program that requires students to take developmental education before they matriculate. And the second is a study of a math emporium model in Tennessee. So to talk a little bit about the descriptive study, and specifically the national survey and the qualitative interviews, we have 9 research questions, and I just want to lay those out briefly. And get your thoughts, hopefully during the session or afterwards, on how we can best answer these questions and what might be most important from your perspective and what we can learn about colleges systematically across the country. So the first research question, the first 5 research questions that I'm going to be talking about were identified by the Institute for Education Sciences as really critical questions to advance our understanding of developmental education. The first is around assessment practices, and we're simply trying to learn what are the assessment tools and practices that colleges currently use? What are the tests they use? How are they placing students? What are the cut scores? And how have these evolved in recent years? So there was a recent study several years ago asking similar questions to colleges across the country. So here we'll have an opportunity to learn not only about what colleges are doing now, but how they're changing their practices in ways that might affect students. So we also have a question about colleges' choices and how they've determined which practices they're going to use. So we want to learn more about why colleges are making decisions, what's informing their decisions about assessment practices and instructional practices. So this could be anything ranging from state policy to system level requirements, but we're trying to get a better sense of what's driving colleges' choices. An important question for the descriptive study is also the questions about instruction. So what are the major strategies colleges use to teach developmental education? We're going to be trying to learn about a range of strategies that colleges may be using to teach developmental education, and how broadly these are affecting students, how many students are participating in the different strategies. These range from dual enrollment programs to curricular changes to summer bridge programs. We know that colleges are innovating in many ways, so we also want to learn about how long colleges have been implementing certain practices and really get a sense of what developmental education students are experiencing across the country. So the fourth question is about how these approaches differ for different types of students. So we want to understand the differences between traditional students and their experiences in developmental education and non-traditional students. So here we define traditional students very broadly as students who are coming directly from high school. And we want to learn if colleges generally have different practices for these types of students than students who are coming back to a college education after a longer period of time. The final research question identified by IES is really focused and motivated by all of the recent work around the Common Core standards. So here we want to know if assessment and instructional practices in community colleges and in four-year colleges are aligned with college readiness criteria that are happening in the K-12 systems, for example, the Common Core readiness standards. Now, in addition to these questions, we identified 4 additional questions that we thought were very important for this kind of research. The first is around open door policy. So colleges, community colleges in particular, have traditionally had an open door policy and allowed all students who are interested to enter. But colleges' changes in their developmental assessment practices have the potential to change this. We're often focused on the highest cut score and cut scores that determine placement into college level courses, but there's also the potential for colleges to use a lower bound, to use a lower cut score that determines whether or not students are in fact ready for developmental education. And this is just one way in which changes in developmental education practices could be more limiting in terms of access. Now, faculty engagement is a huge issue that we've been studying for a while in developmental education, and really drives the extent to which new reforms take hold in colleges and have the chance to affect students. So we're going to be asking colleges the extent to which faculty are widely engaged in the reform, and also the extent to which full-time faculty participate, or whether or not new reforms are primarily implemented by adjuncts. And as we all know, the technology is rapidly advancing and is starting to influence colleges more and more in the way they offer courses, both in the classroom but also through online opportunities for students to take courses or to supplement their instruction, which is another thing we'll be asking about. So finally, each of these components of the study, the survey and the qualitative interviews, include private, for-profit colleges, and so we'll be trying to assess the degree to which practices differ between for-profit colleges and other institutions. So the national survey, as I mentioned, includes 1,700 colleges. It's a wide array of colleges, open access community colleges and non-selective four-year colleges. It includes 2-year and 4-year colleges, public and private schools. It addresses all of the research questions that I just outlined, but it has a particular emphasis on the assessment practices and the instructional practices to try to understand more completely what developmental education looks like across the country. This survey will be administered nationally in 2016. We're piloting the survey this year to try to learn more about not only how to ask these questions in a way that we can systematically survey 1,700 colleges, but also how to find the right people within each of the colleges to ask various questions about math and English language arts. So there will also be 40 qualitative interviews at 40 colleges and 40 systems of higher education. Here we'll be interviewing the people responsible for developmental education policy and programming and really getting a more in-depth picture of what's happening in these colleges. This qualitative study will address all of the research questions, but provide more depth, particularly in the areas that we can't ask about as systematically in the national survey, and this will be conducted throughout 2015. So my name is Alex Mayer. This is, again, in collaboration with CCRC, and my contact information and Shauna Jaggers, who is leading the project at CCRC, is available here. Thank you. Elizabeth?
Want to take any questions?
Sure.
Before I jump in, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to bring up at this point?
The question you had about alignment with Common Core and things like that, I do know that that's something we're thinking about in this whole developing of a transition course in alignment with the Senate bill. And so I wonder whether the questions will be like in time. Like if you were to ask me, do we right now align with Common Core, I would say no. If you were to ask me, are you looking at the potential for aligning, that would be a very different answer. So I wonder what you're accounting for. All of our systems are in such change right now.
Yeah, so her question is about the Common Core and about how rapidly things are changing right now, and trying to assess alignment now versus alignment that's anticipated in the future. And this is really an area where I think it would be helpful to have more of a conversation. This is one of the more difficult things to assess, especially because of the very issues that you're raising. So the clearest opportunity is to really have more in-depth conversations through the qualitative interviews to get at that. We're going to try to use those types of interviews and conversations in conjunction with the pilot to really figure out how best to ask that question. Because we may end up needing to ask more about planning, just as you suggest, rather than what's happening right now, since things are still evolving. But it would be great to talk more about it maybe after this. So let's move on to the other studies, and we can continue talking after all the presentations.
Okay. Where are the other? Okay, I'm Elizabeth Barnett. I'm with the Community College Research Center at Teachers College at Columbia University. And we're very pleased to be partnering again with MDRC. We've, over the years, worked with them closely and on a number of occasions, mainly on studies related to community colleges and developmental education. In this case, the second study that falls under the auspices of the center, which we think we're calling CAPR, but sometimes call CAPR, is the research on alternative placement systems. And, you know, as we've mentioned, that's one of the areas that is of widespread concern and where we're seeing widespread change. As Alex said, you know, there are many students that are placing into developmental education. I like to point out that this is not an issue only in community colleges, but also in open access four-year institutions. So the kinds of solutions that we're looking at most actively in community colleges are also being watched elsewhere. And, you know, Alex talked about the differences in graduation rates of students who place into developmental education. We know part of that is because they come in underprepared, and then perhaps part of it is something that we can address, you know, within the context of colleges. The other piece that we need to attend to, and that many people are attending to, is the fact that many students who are going into developmental education are not having particularly good outcomes. So this is synthesized in a brief that's available on our website, on the Community College Research Center website. But basically it shows that, for example, with the higher level students, the vast majority of outcomes that you look at across studies are either null or negative. So, you know, I think this is the kind of information that people have heard over time, but compel us to look for solutions both in terms of improving developmental education, but then also making sure the right students are in those courses. And one of the things we emphasize is that developmental education is absolutely critical to have available. Without it, students aren't going to have the opportunities to go to college, but, you know, it's something we need to continue looking at. So going to the issue of who's placed into these classes, with several of our colleagues at CCRC did some studies of existing placement exams. One was a state-level study, and the other was a study of an urban system. And what it found is that, while some students are being placed correctly, and correctly based on the predicted likelihood of getting a B or better, in the course, a number of students are not placed correctly. And some of those students are overplaced, meaning that they go into college courses where they're not likely to succeed. But the majority of students who are not correctly placed could have succeeded in those courses. So we see in English, it's almost a third, and in math, it's 18% of students who are considered to be misplaced. And that's using the most commonly, the most prevalent college placement tests that are around. So many people now are talking about using multiple measures to improve placement, with the idea that if you're placing the right students into these courses, you're going to have many more students who are set up for success. And there are several approaches being used. I thought I'd just list three of them here that seem to be pretty prevalent. One is using kind of a hierarchy of measures. So, if you have students that have a certain high school GPA and or have experienced success in high school courses in math or English, then perhaps they wouldn't need to take a placement test. Or perhaps if they had a certain high school GPA and an SAT score of a certain level or ACT score, they wouldn't need to take placement tests. So that's what I'm calling hierarchy of measures. And North Carolina's embarking on that now. That we saw several New York colleges doing that as well. There's also a more nuanced approach being used in Wisconsin, where a panel will get together and look at a range of measures. They'll compile information from the student's transcript, perhaps a writing sample, recommendations, and faculty will make a determination based on a more full review of students' records. And then the third approach is one that Long Beach in California has become famous for, and that's using an algorithm, so basically predictive analytics, and incorporating data from the student's high school transcript with the college placement test data, figuring out the best weight of those measures that are available, and coming up with a prediction and placing students basically on that basis. So in the study that we're working on right now, we're using the predictive analytics approach. And the question that we have is, can we do better, basically? So, we think that if students are placed using some form of multiple measures, in this case we're going to test the data analytics approach, we think that they'll likely do better, but we don't really know. So the idea is to do a random assignment study using with some students placed using a data analytics approach and some students placed using whatever the college's current approach is, and compare them over time and look at whether there are differences in outcomes. And, based on prior research, we think that our students placed using the new method are likely to experience better outcomes. So that's what we're here to find out. So the way this will work is that we'll be working with a set of students in community colleges in New York that are part of the SUNY system. They'll be providing us with data. We've identified most of the colleges. They'll be providing us with data from their college systems for past cohorts. They'll also be providing us with some high school transcript data, and we're still in the process of figuring out what we can get, how much we can get. We'll be taking that and in some cases putting it together with other information we may have, such as students' responses on college applications or to some of the optional questions that may be included, say, on the AccuPlacer, and deciding exactly what mix of factors makes sense to use. So once we have that data in our hands, we will run regressions, come up with basically weights for each of the values, and take that back to the college and help, work with them to make decision rules based on that system. So the faculty will have a very important role in examining that data, making the determinations about where students should place. So once that's been put into place, that will be set up so that it can be tested through the research process. So the research questions are, do student outcomes improve when they're placed using predictive analytics? And secondly, it's going to take some work to put this into place. What exactly is involved? What does it take to implement this, to set it up, and then to keep it going? Because other colleges are going to be very interested in that. And part of that will be looking at what it costs. So here's a map of the colleges that are participating. We've been visiting them this winter. We've had several canceled trips due to weather. But we have made it to 6 out of the 7 so far, and have been learning more about them and getting to know them better. So the research itself, we're finalizing the sites. As I said, developing the right algorithm with each college. We'll beginning with a pilot test in the summer. We'll try out our system for randomizing students into the 2 different groups, make sure that we can build it into systems that colleges currently have for admitting students, testing students, placing students, advising students. We want to try to keep that as smooth as possible. Beginning with the spring of 2016, we expect to fully implement the research for 4 semesters. And then, kind of track how all that works, conduct implementation research, and look at outcomes. So the outcomes that we're most concerned about are how students do in their first college level courses, how they do and how soon they complete their first college level courses in math and English, and then their accumulation of college credits. In other words, are they making faster progress toward completing, toward college graduation than other students? And we're still in the process of defining what other specific outcomes we want to track, semester to semester persistence, some other things are under consideration, and which subgroups we're going to pay attention to. This is just to give you an idea of the kind of flow of the process from consent through testing, through transferring the students' data, to randomly assigning them, to actually placing them. But the whole intervention is the placement. That's what we're testing. We're not asking colleges to change anything else in their process. So emerging issues, as Alex said, one thing that we're noting is that things are happening very fast in developmental education and assessment, instructional reform. So, as we set up these studies, we're having to kind of figure out the extent to which historical data can still predict what's happening as people make these changes. Data's not always available. It's not like most colleges have a full high school transcript in their data system. We're trying to work out, with each college what can be done to get that data into the system. In Long Beach, they negotiated agreements with high schools and, pull the data in from them directly. And the other thing is that there's sometimes a tension between setting up a system that works well for research and then one that's just, going to be able to persist into the future. If we assume that these systems turn out to be effective, we want colleges to be able to keep them going. And so we're trying to make sure that we're taking that into account. So that's the team working on this project. Is there any burning question before we move ahead? Yeah.
In particular, when you're talking about the underplaced population in English, the 29%, do you disaggregate between students who just entered out of high school versus students who may have been out of school for 15 or 20 years? Is there a separation of those 2 populations when looking at underplaced students?
That 29% includes everybody. And I'm not sure whether in the paper that's disaggregated. I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I should have repeated the question, which is was the population who was underplaced in English separated into recent high school graduates and longer-term students, and the 29% included both. So, yeah, Peter.
You all at CCRC and MDRC have done an admirable job in recent years of looking at period that the city colleges in Chicago were using, the non-cognitive assessments like Success Navigator, grid scales, machine-scored essays, or even human-scored essays?
That's a great question. So we went into this thinking that we would, so the question is, have we thought about looking at a wider range of potential measures, either tests or student self-reports or perhaps faculty-graded assessments of different kinds. We went into it with trying to have a very open mind about the possible range of data points we could include. Our biggest challenge has been that unless we have, with this particular method, unless we have historical data, we don't have a way to predict the future. So we are in the process of trying to talk with a couple of colleges about perhaps for the first year, especially using a non-cognitive assessment is something we've been very interested in, and then changing the algorithm the second year so that it takes that into account. But I think you're raising a good question about kind of the range of other possibilities, and you know, we are interested in kind of keeping our eye on those. So why don't we go ahead and do the other?
Hi everyone, my name is Alyssa Ratledge and I'm from MDRC, and I'm going to talk about our other RCT, randomized control trial, which is of the New Mathways project in Texas. Before we get started, if you're standing in the back, there are some empty seats up front, so please feel free to come grab them. I promise not to spit on you. And I also want to encourage you, if you have questions during this presentation, please shout out, raise your hand, whatever the case may be. It can get a little complicated, so you know, grab me at any time, and no need to wait till the end. So some of you may be familiar with the New Mathways project. This is a project undertaken by the Charles A. Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin. The goal is to implement a statewide math reform across the entire state of Texas. So everyone in this room knows that developmental math is a challenge. Yuri Treisman, who's the executive director at the Charles A. Dana Center, calls it a burial ground, and I think a lot of us can relate to that here. The stats in Texas are not that much better than the stats nationally, or that much worse, frankly, for students completing their courses. You know, less than half of students are coming into college ready, and only about 13% are ever completing a college-level math course. So the goal of New Mathways is to get those students to completing a college-level math course. NMP has 4 main components. The first, and perhaps the most famous, is that it involves multiple pathways. So traditionally, all students are funneled into college algebra, regardless of what their major or career plan is. In New Mathways, students end up with 3 different college-level math options. The first is to go into statistics. So this would be for students in majors like criminal justice, sociology, a lot of nursing programs. So majors that use statistics in their majors, and jobs that use statistics on a day-to-day basis. A student studying sociology is going to come across statistics much more often than they're going to come across graphing. The second component is, the second class is Quantitative Reasoning, which is analogous to a Math for Liberal Arts course that many of your campuses might offer. Majors for this might be something like visual arts, a lot of the liberal arts, so it's a much more contextualized and relevant math. And then the third pathway is the algebra, pre-calc, calculus pathway that's predominantly aimed at STEM majors. The second component is acceleration. The goal is to get students through their developmental courses more quickly and get to finishing a college-level course more quickly as well. So for students who would be taking statistics or quantitative reasoning, this would be completing all developmental math in 1 semester and then your college-level math course in a 2nd semester. So you could really be completing your entire math requirement in just 1 year. The third component is to help students develop skills as learners. So rather than just emphasizing rote memorization, this is encouraging students to think quantitatively, to do a lot of mathematical reasoning in their course, and develop their confidence and their skills. The fourth component is curriculum design. The Dana Center has created a curriculum for the courses that colleges can use that really spells out the types of lessons that should be involved. So this emphasizes things like using real-world data sets, solving real-life problems, and there's a large active learning component to the courses. So students do a lot of group work and active learning work, including using technology such as statistical software, rather than it being a predominantly lecture-based course. So the NMP courses start off with 2 linked courses in the first semester. The first is a framework student success course, which might be somewhat similar to your student success courses, but again has a large active learning component and emphasizes students growing as learners. The Foundations of Mathematical Reasoning is the developmental math course. So that would replace up to 2 levels of developmental math compressed into a single semester. It is also more closely articulated to a statistics or quantitative reasoning college-level course rather than being algebra-based. So rather than focusing on algebraic skills like factoring and graphing, it focuses on pre-statistical or pre-quantitative reasoning skills. So that might be things like heavy work with percentages, plugging things into formulas and equations, and work like that. In the next semester, students might go into either of the 3 pathways. So you can see here that there's a STEM prep pathway that hasn't been developed yet. It's still in the planning stages, but it would complement or replace the existing algebra pathway. There's college statistics, which is the course that most of the schools implementing new mathways are implementing now. And then there's college quantitative reasoning, which a few schools in Texas have begun implementing, but it's going to look at a larger implementation later. For our study, we're just focusing on the college statistics course. It has been around the longest, and it also applies to the largest number of relevant majors. So it really has the potential to affect the largest number of students at the moment. So the players in Texas are the Charles A. Dana Center, and they are the ones who created the new Mathways curriculum. Another key player is the Texas Association of Community Colleges. One of the goals of the new Mathways project is to implement this across the entire state of Texas. And I think we all know that requires some big state-level support to make that happen. One of the issues that was run into pretty early on is an issue of transfer. If students are taking a math class at their 2-year school and they plan to transfer to a 4-year, that course needs to transfer. You can't have students taking statistics in community college only to be told when they get to the flagship university, guess what, you have to start back over with algebra. So partnerships between the Dana Center and TAC, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, have been very vital in making those pathways articulate, making it all kind of work for students. You don't want to put students in something that's not going to work for them. So for MDRC and CCRC, we have 3 main research questions. The first is we just want to know if students do better in NMP than they do in traditional math programs. Do they get through more quickly? Do they accumulate more credits? Do they persist? Second, we want to know how these courses look different from a traditional course. So I mentioned some components are things like active learning, heavy use of technology, real-world data sets. When the courses are implemented, do they use these components? Do they really look different? Finally, we want to look at whether or not it's cost effective. So NMP does cost a little bit more to implement. It's more taxing on math instructors' time. So we want to know if it's worth it. Is it something that is worth doing? Generally, we're also going to look at things like student engagement and fidelity of implementation. So how are the courses implemented? But those are secondary to our main research questions listed here. Are there any questions that I can answer right now? Yes?
So I think one of the many of the goals of NMP are also around kind of learning outcomes, constructive perseverance, things like that. Are you
Right.
looking at any of that?
So his question is about whether we're going to look at things like constructive perseverance and other learning outcomes that might be associated with some of the goals of this. We would like to do so. Those are much harder to measure than looking at students' credit accumulation, but it is our goal to look at those through some kind of pre-post assessment or a survey. Great. So I'll talk a little bit about MDRC's research so far and then transition into where this puts us for the center as a whole. So MDRC researchers, including our project director, have been involved with NMP pretty much since its inception, working for quite a few semesters now, as colleges in Texas have begun implementing the program. So we have been working with and observing the colleges through preparation phase, and then their first 2 semesters of implementation. We also collected some student outcomes data to see how students were doing, not really compared to anyone else, but just to see, are students passing? If students enrolled in this course and 0% of them passed, I think we'd all know what that means regardless. So I am going to present a few of our early findings. Most of these are from our qualitative implementation work, and they have to do with how the courses operate and how they run. So especially for faculty administrators in the room, you might have questions with this. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time. So generally, we found that there was very strong commitment among faculty and staff to the idea of pathways. Generally, faculty and staff thought that it made sense to match a student's college-level math requirement to their major or career. It makes sense for a student taking engineering to go into calculus, but does it really make sense for a student going into sociology to take calculus when instead they could take statistics? So generally, everyone could agree that that was pretty useful. Students were also very interested in the pathways and liked the idea of taking something that had a little more real-life context. I think it's very common at all schools for students to say things like, I'm never going to use this math in real life. So being able to provide them with real solid examples of how math is used in real life, students responded very positively to that. However, there were some significant obstacles in terms of recruiting students, even if they were interested. One of the major obstacles, as I mentioned, was transfer. Students were very nervous that their math course taken in community college wouldn't transfer to a 4-year, and they didn't want to risk it if they could just take algebra and know that that would work. In addition, there was some concern about the scheduling. So as I mentioned before, the Foundations math course is linked with a student success course, and that made it very challenging for a lot of students, especially part-time or non-traditional students, to enroll in both courses because they couldn't make them fit in their schedule or they weren't able to cover that number of hours. In terms of teaching NMP, the faculty at all of the schools implemented the courses with very high fidelity, sometimes to the detriment of their own mental health. The courses are very difficult to implement, like any course you're teaching for the first time. And because it has so many components that are different from a lecture course, things like active learning, a large technology component, it was pretty challenging. Overall, the faculty were happy that they had taught the course and thought that in future semesters it wouldn't be as challenging, but it was a big push at first. Overall, the courses did look different. So a traditional algebra course at most of these colleges looks like 90% lecture and perhaps 10% interactive with students. For NMP, that would be reversed. You'd have about 90% active learning, group work, interaction, and 10% or less of actual professor instruction at the chalkboard. Generally, the students liked the courses, especially the math courses, but they were kind of mixed about the student success course. It didn't really tie well to the math, so they were questioning whether it was really that useful, especially students who had taken a student success course previously. So as I mentioned, the faculty were very pleased with the real-world context. So here's a quote from a faculty member here that when students are given real-world problems, it really allows them to grow mathematically. So the faculty member here said they're challenging what they'll see on TV or see in a magazine. They're really using math in their life, which is a really valuable outcome. I think a lot of us here struggle to respond to that, when am I ever going to use math? And this is a good way to think about it. They also found that generally students had increased engagement due to the fact that it was a lot of active learning and group work, and that they were very pleased that it was relevant to students' majors, again reinforcing that real-world context of the math. However, as I mentioned, there were a lot of concerns about prep time, about how difficult it was. In addition, since the courses are less algebra-based, a number of faculty were concerned about the rigor of the courses. So are these courses really preparing students for a college-level math course if they don't have enough algebra in them? And finally, there were challenges with the technology platform, which is very frustrating, but not to be unexpected with any new initiative. So students were generally very pleased with the math courses. They were excited about how fast they could get through math. Telling a student you can complete developmental and college level math in a year is really exciting. They really responded to that. They also liked that it was a real world class with real world data sets, real applications. So let me give you an example of what this might look like. In a normal algebra course, you might calculate the perimeter of a rectangle. In foundations, you would calculate the perimeter of a fence in your yard, and then calculate how many fence posts would be needed for that perimeter, and then calculate how much it would cost. So it's a much more realistic idea. Some of the very popular lessons in here were how to calculate your BMI, how to calculate your blood alcohol level. Students loved knowing this. They went home and told people about it. They were calculating each other's BMIs outside of class. It was a very exciting application of math, but students were also learning how to plug numbers into a formula and to figure out whether answers make sense given the inputs that you're putting into a problem. Students had mixed opinions about the active learning, which I think is not unexpected. Some students really like working in groups. Some students really don't like working in groups. They don't want to work with the students. They want lecture. Students were also frustrated with the technology platform. One thing to consider is the technology level of your students. So if you have a lot of non-traditional students who are very weak with their computer skills, they tend to struggle more with technology generally, and certainly with this class as well. But I think the key thing here is that of the students that we talked to at all of the colleges, the majority would recommend NMP courses to a friend. They said, I have told people about this course, that it's a new option, and that it really worked for me. So I'm going to look at a little bit of data. Just as a reminder, these are just general student outcomes. They're not compared to anything else, but they give you a sense of how students did in the courses in the first year. So we looked at 3 outcomes here. We wanted to look at whether or not students were completing developmental math, whether they were then immediately enrolling in their college level math course, and finally, if they were passing that course. So what we want to see is that students within a year really are fulfilling their math requirement. So if you take a look here, this is for all the colleges offering foundations, which is 7 colleges across the state of Texas. About 233 students were enrolled. You can see here that 65% of the students in those courses passed foundations. That means that they completed their developmental math requirement. 46% of students enrolled in statistical reasoning, so it's not a terrible retention rate, although we are not seeing all students subsequently enrolling. But finally, 30% of students are passing their statistical reasoning course. This is our key outcome of interest here. We want to see that students are completing their math requirement entirely. 30% doesn't sound that good, but when you think about what students are doing nationally, it's actually not that bad. If you're thinking about only about 10 or 20% of students ever completing developmental math and a college level math course, seeing 30% complete in just 1 year is pretty promising. And it's one of the reasons that we're interested in seeing where New Mathways is going to go next. So what we're working on now, in the 2015-2016 school year, we're conducting a random assignment evaluation with 2 colleges in Texas, El Paso Community College, which is in El Paso, and Trinity Valley Community College, which is in Athens, which is southeast of Dallas. In the 2016-2017 school year, we're hoping to add a few more colleges to the evaluation, so if anyone is interested, let us know. And then we'll also be doing a cost study and an implementation study to see what these look like from those perspectives as well. So if you're interested, you can talk to me after this, or shoot me an email at this address, or our project director. I'm happy to take questions about Mathways or about either of the other studies, and they did recommend that people use the microphone, which is right here, so if you wouldn't mind, that would be great. Any questions? Yes?
So was that 30% of the original cohort?
Yes, so that's 30% of the students who enrolled in foundations originally. Sorry? Sir, sorry about that.
How many actually passed that did enroll?
Let me pull back to that slide. So 65% passed the developmental course and 30% passed the college level course. Sure.
Okay, so, understanding that the people that, 30% of people that started successfully completed is a great way to understand throughput. One of the big concerns I hear people say is they're afraid that students that go through accelerated courses then can't cut it in college level material. So I'm curious, of those students that did make it in, did only 30% of those students pass the course, or was it a higher number?
Sure, so her question is about the actual passing rates. So in Texas, for the vast majority of majors that are not STEM majors, just one college level math course is required. So what you're looking at here is that 30% of students who enrolled in these courses completed their college level math course. Now, if your concern is generally about whether the students can eventually cut it in other courses, it's too soon for us to know since this is just last year. Our hope is that they would be able to go on, but again, the majority of these students, this is their terminal math course. So after your NMP statistical reasoning, there's not another math course. But one outcome that we will want to look at qualitatively is if students go on to take a different course. So for instance, if you need to take a research methods course that requires some statistical knowledge, do students feel prepared for it? But that's further out, it's just too soon to tell.
Was the question also that was, what was the regular pass rate of students for that class? The ones not taking remedial classes?
So they're not directly comparable. This statistical reasoning course is an NMP statistical reasoning course, so it's a different setup of course. We don't have the information about the general passing rates, although they're pretty similar to what we saw on the first slide. About 13% of students are passing a college level math course. But it's difficult to compare because they may or may not be the same students. So students may select into this course and not really be the same. They might have been likelier to succeed. The faculty might have been different. So it's really hard to compare the numbers directly. Yes?
You made a comment that there was a concern, students voiced a concern about the student success course. Was that course, who was that designed by? Who taught it?
Sure, so her question is about the student success course and students' reaction to it. So the curriculum for the student success course was also created by the Charles A. Dana Center, and it's also active learning heavy, developing skills as learners type of course with a lot of career development and major development tasks and within the course. Students generally thought it was okay. A lot of students didn't really see the value, which is true to all student success courses that are taught. A lot of students think, I don't need this, even if they do. So that's a fact of life about student success courses. In addition, a lot of students had this idea, since the courses were linked, that it was going to be more of a math lab support type course, and when it turned out to be a student success course, they were not as impressed, especially students who had taken a student success course before, said, I've taken this before, what I actually need is supplemental instruction in math. So part of it was a matching question. And some of the schools moving forward are not planning on linking them anymore, so students would be able to take the math course without the student success course, but that varies by college. Her other question is who was teaching the course. The course was typically taught by people who are prepared to teach student success courses, so people with masters in psychology, education, that type of certification. A lot of colleges pulled on their existing student success course faculty to teach the course. Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in the depth of faculty engagement. Can you quantify when you say strong commitment by faculty? How many faculty, how many colleges, how many courses? In Texas, we have 700,000 community college students by easy numbers, and half of them are in developmental education. 233 is nothing. Is that just because that's all you studied, or is that because we're in the early stage of NPM? And it's to your first survey, first study, how are you going to measure faculty engagement in your survey?
Sure, so his question is about overall faculty engagement, and I'll answer quickly for NMP and then let Alex answer for the descriptive study. So the reason that there's 233 is because this was the very first semester this course existed. So it was kind of like a pilot, only being offered at 7 or 8 schools. You're completely right that many faculty were not involved and therefore could not be engaged, but the faculty who were engaged generally were pretty supportive, especially at the beginning, and were thinking about how students could be brought into different pathways. So I think faculty engagement is always a challenge, especially at the colleges who are looking to scale up now. They need to get all of their faculty on board. They need to see that all of their faculty can teach. But that's an ongoing question. But I'll let Alex answer for the...
Yeah, so the other question was about how we're going to measure faculty engagement in the National Descriptive Study. It's a very good question and one that we're still figuring out. We have two main strategies now. One is to ask, it's difficult to do at a systematic level. So we can ask through the survey questions about who is involved in different kinds of reforms, how many faculty are participating, do they tend to be full-time or adjuncts, and get sort of a higher level sense of who's participating in the reforms through the national survey. That we can do very well systematically. But in terms of really understanding the qualitative nature of what that engagement looks like, it's much more challenging to do systematically, which is why we have these qualitative interviews where we can really probe more deeply through a number of institutions to really understand what that engagement looks like on the ground. How can we understand the depth of the engagement and what it really means? Now, the way the whole descriptive study is set up is that we have this first year where we're conducting the qualitative interviews. We can learn more about the depth of that engagement. We can learn more about it through the piloting the survey, and we're hoping that we can structure some deeper questions that we can ask more systematically, but we haven't figured exactly what those will be. So if you have ideas, it would be great to discuss, but it's really an evolution right now. But thank you for the question. Yes?
I have a question about the national study, maybe about placement too. At our college, students can go into a developmental track or an English as a second language track, which both go into the credit level classes. So I'm wondering, are you disaggregating between those but there is some crossover, of course, because some of those students are coming from, some of the students who go into ESL are coming from high school. And they could go either way. So how are you analyzing, how are you going to account for that?
So the question is, how are we going to account for students who are placed into developmental education versus who are placed into English as a second language? So at your college, is English as a second language a credit-bearing course for those students?
It's an alternate pathway. So if they go, if they're placed into ESL and they finish the levels of ESL, they would go to credit to the English 101, like, the first credit-bearing course.
Right.
They don't go through the developmental pathway, but they have to take a series of classes that are below English 101.
So they have to take a series of classes that are below college level. So that's something that we can assess systematically through the national survey by asking the question exactly in the way you framed it. So are students having to go into non-credit bearing, non-college level courses, such as English as a second language? Again, it's another reason why we're piloting the survey to, we can find out how extensive these are in a smaller number of colleges, but it's something we certainly want to account for. And again, it's something that we can really get richer information about through these qualitative interviews. But it's a very good a point to make that we'll consider for the survey. Thank you. Are there any other questions about any of the studies? No. So I hear we're out of time. I just want to thank you again for coming and for all of your comments so far. Both of our organizations have a long history with achieving the dream. We're very excited to be here, and I'd encourage you to talk with us afterwards if you have remaining questions or ideas.